Come, let us attend, let us hear the holy gospel. Peace be with all.
And with your spirit.
The holy gospel according to St. John. Let us be attentive.
Glory to you, O Lord. Glory to you.
At that time when Jesus was passing by, he saw a man blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered him, saying, It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be made manifest in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night comes when no one can work. And as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And as he said this, he spat on the ground, and he made clay of the spit, and anointed the man's eyes with the clay, saying to him, Go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. And so he went and he washed, and he came back seeing. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar said, Is this not the man who used to sit and beg? And some said, It is he. And others said, No, but he is like him. And he said, I am the man. And they said to him, Then how were your eyes open? And he answered, The man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, Go to Siloam and wash. And so I went and I washed, and I received my sight. And they said to him, Who is he? And he said, I do not know. And then they brought him to the Pharisees, the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay and opened the eyes. And the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, You put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. And some of the Pharisees said, This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others said, How can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. So they again said to the blind man, What do you say about him since he opened your eyes? And he said, He is a prophet. And the Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he see? And his parents answered, We know that this is our son, and that the son was born blind. But now how he sees we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself. And his parents said this because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess him to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. And therefore his parents said, He is of age, ask him. So for the second time they called a man who had been blind and said to him, Give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner. And he answered, Whether he is a sinner I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see. And they said to him, What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he answered them, I told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you too want to become his disciples? And they reviled him, saying, You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. And the man answered, Why, this is a marvel. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if everyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And they answered him, You were born in utter sin, and you would teach us? And they cast him out. And Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, Do you believe in the Son of God? And he answered, And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? And Jesus said to him, You have seen him, and he it is who speaks to you. Then the man who was born blind said, Lord, I believe. And then the man worshiped Jesus.
Glory
Christ is risen.
Truly is risen.
Christos anesti.
Alithos anesti.
Christos vos kres. Boistinu vos kres. Don't know my Russian. Today is a man born blind. There's the icon. And the fathers say that his blindness was probably being born with no eyes. So it's not that he had eyes and were blind. It was that his eyes were either not there or just horribly deformed, not developed properly. Why do they say that? Because Christ spit into the clay and put the clay on his eyes. All right? He forms man out of the dust of the ground. When the primordial word was spoken, and that the logos, that logic that creates something new out of something else, happened again when he put the clay on his eyes, and his eyes were formed in their sockets. That's the extent of the healing. That's how marvelous it was. That's what the fathers say. And it goes back to the very beginning of creation and how what is came to be, which is a topic for another time. Very interesting, but a topic for another time. But what we see here is that he creates for the blind man eyes anew. So imagine if you were living 2,000 years ago and you saw this beggar who probably had his eyelids closed and they were probably sunk in, and there was just no way that this man was destined for anything but being a beggar because of his physical circumstances and also the way the culture was in the time. Walking around with eyes open, talking to people, completely healed. It would have been absolutely astonishing, as most miracles are and remain today. Because the man heard someone come up to him, and mark that, note that, because it's very important, heard someone come up to him and offer him the healing, and he accepts what is offered, and then he's told to go into the pool of Siloam, a pool where the angel of the Lord would come and stir the waters, that type of thing, and wash yourself and you would see. And that's exactly what happened to him. That's exactly what happened to him. However, now there's so much to say in this parable. It's profound. However, what happens to the man? As soon as his sight is restored, he gets challenged. He gets challenged. And he's hauled off in front of the Pharisees, who begin to question him. Were you really blind? Have you really been healed? Is this all really true? They called his parents in as well. In order to what? And I go to Chrysostom for this, St. John Chrysostom. In order to answer charges to questions that were designed to deny that the miracle had even occurred. That's why. Because the light had come into the world, the light that makes blind men see, and those who had a stake in the status quo and the established order wanted to deny it. Why? Because they did not have the power. Why did they not have the power? Because they did not have the faith. And this Jesus who no one knew, this Jesus that they said is a sinner, we listen to Moses, you listen to this man, brought something into the world that they did not possess. They had no faith. They really had no faith. That's the problem. They did not understand this God that they purported to serve. And even their service was for the praise of men and not for the praise of God. They sought not obedience, but what they sought was stature. Pride trumps humility. And that's why when the light of the world comes into the world, they had to portray that light as darkness. We follow Moses. Who does this man follow? This man healed on the Sabbath. He breaks the law of Moses. He cannot be from God. Twisting the very logic of the law to justify themselves in front of the people. What drove them ultimately? In the end, pride and envy. But they occupied high stations in their society, and they misused their call to leadership to stamp out the light. Now it happened that the blind man was called into that conflict almost immediately. Why? Because the miracle was so significant. If he had healed a broken toe or something, that would have been a great thing, but not like restoring sight to the blind. And because the miracle could not be denied, it had to be doubted and ultimately forgotten. And that's why the religious leadership of the time took the approach that they did. The blind man, however, because he was the recipient of this great and marvelous miracle, as I said, was thrust into the conflict almost immediately. Now, St. John Chrysostom says, he says that's kind of a model of the spiritual life too. It really is. That if we believe and we see, because of our faith, the marvelous works of God, and these works are concrete, they're real, they happen. The power we see 2,000 years ago is the same power that is given to us. That we too will be called in front of the magistrates of our time, whoever they may be. In our case, what? Christians are often mocked. Christians are mischaracterized. Christians are no longer accepted by a large portion of our society as worth listening to. They've got to be stopped. It's not so much different today than it was back then. But why is this? Why is this? Because the light is light. Because the light illumines. Because the power of God will be with anyone who believes. Anyone who believes. And he will work his work through those people. But there are those who don't want the light. They prefer the darkness. I'm not talking about the darkness of ignorance. The darkness of ignorance is something different than the darkness of hatred and despising the light. And so, Christians too, those who are Christians in word and truth, which is to say that they obey God and seek to obey him, and they see him as the ultimate master, that there's no one that stands between them and God, and so they listen to God, they too will be called in front of the magistrates. They too will suffer some kind of abuse, disparagement, whatever it may be, just like the blind man did. But look what happens. Even though the blind man was thrust into this conflict almost immediately, a conflict he did not choose. The healing was a gift, right? And he didn't know. He didn't know that he would be thrust into this conflict when he was healed. Nevertheless, knows that he was healed, and that healing himself, that action of Christ in his life, became his confidence. And then later, when the meeting between the authorities and the blind men ended, he meets Jesus. He meets the one who healed him. It's very interesting. So even though he was in the conflict, Jesus was outside. Jesus knew this was happening. The man held his own, leaves the conflict, and Jesus comes up to him. But he does not recognize Jesus. He doesn't recognize him. Why wouldn't he recognize Jesus, you might ask? Because he couldn't see him. He couldn't see him. So Jesus comes up to him and he doesn't know who he is until what? Until he hears his voice. That's how the Lord works with us. We hear before we see. And the Lord is always with us like he was with the blind man, even though the blind man thought when he was in the conference, in the conflict with the authorities, that he was alone. He stood on what he knew, and they cast him out. But yet the Lord meets him, and then he sees who he first heard. I'm not going to believe in God until I have the proof and I have the evidence and I see. It's not about seeing. It's about hearing. It's about the Word of God. It's the Word that penetrates the heart. And when one gives the heart to God, then the sight gets clarified. The washing in the pool of Siloam was like a baptism. It really was. It was like a baptism. It was a washing. It was a purgation of all sin, so that this man could become a follower of Jesus Christ and ultimately a son, an adopted son of God after the resurrection and all that. But the Lord speaks to us, and in the speaking and in the hearing, the comprehension and the understanding and the seeing comes. He reveals himself to us. We're like the blind man in a lot of ways, because the capacity to see is a gift from God to us of sight. Of sight. It really is. And the sight is restored, and this continues throughout our whole life. The sight is restored and clarified more and more the more we listen and obey. Go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself. Put off your sin, because the sin is what causes the blindness. The sin is what prevents us from seeing clearly. But I am a faithful God. I'm a merciful God. I love you all, and I give you my word so you may obey, and in the obedience you may see. That's why it's such a marvelous miracle, because it reveals to us who God is and how he works with us. But be sober. Be sober. Being a follower of Christ always imposes a cross. You will be, at times, you will be vilified. You will be criticized. You will be made fun of. But those who are doing the criticizing and the vilifying, and those who mock, don't have light. Because you don't mock life. You don't criticize that which is true. You don't vilify things that bring wholeness and health and healing and restoration into the world. You don't. This is why the blind man did not cave. And this is why the martyrs if necessary, go to their death. That's why. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please rise.